I live with a rescue bobcat who thinks he's the boss of us. Try not to laugh. In the middle of the quiet living room of a log cabin nestled among the Red Rock Mountains of Sedona, Arizona, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Sterling stood frozen, his liver-spotted hands trembling slightly as they gripped a steaming cup of coffee. The ceramic mug rattled faintly against its saucer. His pale blue eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding before him. A scene so peculiar that his 72-year-old mind struggled to process it. Zed, the Siberian Husky whose boundless energy had earned him the nickname Goofy Tornado from every neighbor within a 5-mile radius, sat perfectly still. Not a single muscle twitched. His 4 white paws were planted stiffly against the worn floorboards as if they had been nailed there. The dog's trademark grin had vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute focus that Sterling had never witnessed in the 3 years since he had adopted the hyperactive canine. Standing directly before Zed was Jax. The rescue bobcat weighed nearly 20 kilograms, his compact body rippling with lean muscle beneath his tawny spotted coat. His tufted black ears stood erect like twin radar dishes, swiveling minutely to catch every sound in the cabin. Jax's large paw rested firmly on Zed's shoulder, the weight of it pressing down with deliberate pressure. The bobcat's burning amber eyes locked onto the husky's ice-blue gaze with an intensity that could melt stone. There was no growl, no hiss, no display of teeth, just that unwavering stare, that unmistakable posture of authority. It reminded Sterling of drill sergeants he had known in his younger days, men who could command absolute obedience with nothing more than their presence. Sterling cleared his throat, preparing to break the suffocating tension that filled the room, before a single word could leave his lips. Jax's head turned slightly in his direction. The glance lasted no more than a second, but it contained volumes. Those amber eyes held a natural authority that made Sterling's words die in his throat. He took an involuntary step backward, his slippers scraping against the wooden floor. The coffee sloshed dangerously close to the rim of his cup. Sterling felt like a subordinate employee who had just been caught making a critical error by the CEO. The sensation was so absurd, being silently commanded by a 20-kilogram feline, that he would have laughed if his body had not instinctively obeyed. This strange and dramatic connection had begun 6 months earlier. On a sweltering August afternoon when Sterling had driven his old pickup truck to the Arizona Wildlife Rescue Center, the woman at the front desk, a weathered ranger named Patricia with sun-damaged skin and kind eyes, had walked him through the facility's kennels and enclosures. They passed injured hawks, orphaned fox kits, and a young coyote with a splinted leg before stopping in front of a reinforced enclosure in the back corner. Inside, a bobcat lay curled in the farthest corner, his back pressed against the concrete wall. Patricia explained that Jax had been found 6 weeks prior, after a catastrophic flash flood had torn through the northern basin. The storm had been one of the worst in decades, transforming dry creek beds into raging torrents within minutes. Rescue workers had discovered Jax nearly drowned in a sea of red mud, his body so exhausted he could barely lift his head. What Jax needed now, Patricia had said, was an owner with patience, someone who understood that wild souls carried wounds deeper than any veterinarian could treat, someone willing to live with a creature that had been traumatized beyond what most people could comprehend. Sterling had looked into those wary amber eyes and seen something familiar, something broken that matched the cracks in his own heart. He had signed the adoption papers that same day. The first day Jax arrived at the log cabin, Sterling had expected fear or confusion. What he got instead was calculation. When Sterling opened the transport cage in the center of the living room, Jax did not bolt out in panic or slink away to hide. He froze. For 10 full minutes, the bobcat remained motionless in the open doorway of the cage, his muscles coiled in a defensive posture. His amber eyes swept methodically across every corner of the room, measuring distances, cataloging furniture, mapping escape routes. Sterling watched, fascinated, as Jax's gaze moved from the windows to the doors, from the stone fireplace to the exposed ceiling beams. Only after completing this thorough surveillance did Jax take his first tentative step onto the floorboards. For the first 2 weeks, Jax was a ghost. He moved through the cabin like smoke, barely making a sound, always choosing paths that kept him farthest from Sterling. He refused to sleep anywhere visible. Every night, when Sterling woke at 2 or 3 in the morning to use the bathroom, he would see Jax's silhouette perched atop the highest bookshelf. The bobcat sat perfectly still, a dark shadow against the moonlight streaming through the windows. His golden eyes never closed, always watching, always vigilant against threats that existed only in his traumatized mind. Touch was absolutely forbidden whenever Sterling approached, even just to set down a bowl of food. Jax would retreat exactly 10 feet away. If Sterling stepped closer, Jax would huff, a sharp exhalation through his nose that served as both warning and boundary. Sterling learned quickly to respect that invisible line. Gradually, as the weeks turned into months, Jax began to establish order within the cabin. He did not use vocalizations or displays of aggression. Instead, he used scent and presence. Sterling observed Jax rubbing his chin against the corners of the highest wooden shelves, his cheeks against the windowsills, his flanks against the sturdy legs of the dining table. These were territorial markers, invisible to human eyes, but clear as painted lines to anyone with a wild soul. The incident with the window seat happened on a crisp October morning. Zed, who had been living in the cabin for 3 years before Jax's arrival, was in the middle of one of his typical manic episodes. The husky raced through the living room, tongue lolling, tail wagging so hard his entire hindquarters wiggled. He rounded the coffee table and aimed himself like a furry missile toward the cushioned window seat that overlooked the red rock formations. It was his favorite spot for watching birds and squirrels. But in the 3 months since Jax's arrival, the window seat had become the bobcat's primary observation post. Jax had claimed it through patient occupation, spending hours there each day, watching the desert landscape with the focus of a trained sentinel. Now, as Zed charged toward it at full speed, Jax was already there, sitting motionless in the center of the cushion. The bobcat did not move. He did not tense or prepare to strike. He simply sat, facing forward, his gaze directed out the window at the red rocks beyond. But something in his absolute stillness, some invisible force field of authority, made Zed suddenly aware of what he was about to do. The husky's eyes went wide. His paws scrambled against the smooth wooden floor, claws scratching frantically as he tried to break. He slid sideways, his shoulder bumping into the side of the armchair, finally coming to a stop a full 2 feet away from the window seat. Zed looked at Jax, then at the cushion, then back at Jax. He whined softly, tucked his tail, and retreated to his dog bed in the corner. The lesson had been taught without a single swipe of claws or flash of teeth. The meal supervision began shortly after. Zed had always been a voracious eater, attacking his food bowl with such enthusiasm that kibble often scattered across the kitchen floor. One evening, as Sterling set down Zed's dinner and the husky lunged forward, Jax appeared on the kitchen counter. The bobcat moved silently, his padded paws making no sound against the tile surface. He sat regally, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws, and watched. When Zed's nose was 2 inches from his bowl, ready to inhale his meal in record time, Jax extended a single front paw. One curved claw emerged, hooking delicately over the rim of the metal bowl. The weight was negligible, but the message was absolute. Zed froze. He looked up at Jax, who stared back with unwavering intensity. The husky whined, a high-pitched sound of confusion and submission. Then, very slowly, Zed lowered his head and began to eat, one piece of kibble at a time. His teeth clicked against each individual morsel. He chewed thoroughly before swallowing. Jax remained motionless throughout the entire meal, his claw resting lightly on the bowl's edge, a referee ensuring the rules were followed. Only after Zed had finished, licking the bowl clean with careful, measured strokes, did Jax retract his claw and jump down from the counter. The sunspot claiming ritual was perhaps the most fascinating display of Jax's quiet authority. Every afternoon, around 3 o'clock, a single shaft of golden sunlight would stream through the western window, creating a perfect rectangle of warmth on the living room floor. Zed loved that spot. Before Jax's arrival, the husky would sprawl across it, basking in the heat like a furry solar panel. But now the dynamic had changed. Jax never rushed to claim the sunspot. He simply positioned himself approximately 10 centimeters away from where Zed lay, sitting perfectly still in the shadows just beyond the light's edge. The bobcat did not look at Zed. He stared straight ahead, or sometimes at nothing at all. His gaze directed into the middle distance, but his presence was enormous. The weight of his attention, even though it was not directly focused on the husky, created an invisible pressure. Zed would shift uncomfortably. His ears would flatten. He would glance at Jax, then at the sunspot, then back at Jax. Within 5 minutes, sometimes less, Zed would stand up, stretch elaborately as if it had been his decision all along, and pad away to find somewhere else to nap. Only then would Jax step into the warm rectangle of light, settle down with a contented huff, and close his eyes. One memorable evening, Zed had been lying in front of the stone fireplace, watching the flames dance behind the mesh screen. His own shadow, magnified and distorted by the firelight, flickered across the redstone wall, for reasons known only to the canine mind. Zed decided this shadow was a threat. He leaped to his feet and began barking furiously, his voice echoing through the cabin with enough volume to rattle the windows. His hackles were raised, his tail stiff. He barked and barked, lunging at the wall, utterly convinced he was protecting his territory from an intruder. Sterling had just started to rise from his armchair, ready to calm the hysterical dog. When Jax moved, the bobcat jumped down from his perch on the bookshelf and walked deliberately towards Zed. He did not run or pounce, he simply walked, each paw placed with precise intention. Jax positioned himself directly between Zed and the wall, his body casting an enormous shadow that completely engulfed the husky's smaller silhouette. The firelight made Jax's shadow monstrous, a giant predator looming over the terrified dog. Zed's barking stopped as if someone had pressed a mute button. His mouth hung open, mid-bark, as he stared up at the massive shadow. He looked at the shadow, then at Jax, then back at the shadow, very slowly. Zed backed away, his tail tucked so far between his legs it nearly touched his belly. He slunk to the farthest corner of the cabin, behind the dining table, and lay down with his nose pressed against the floor. Another lesson taught, another boundary established. But Jax's role in the household extended far beyond managing Zed's behavior. The bobcat had become Sterling's guardian, a self-appointed protector who took his duties with deadly seriousness. Sterling had begun to notice how Jax's ears were always moving, swiveling independently like sophisticated radar equipment. When Sterling dozed in his favorite armchair after lunch, Jax would position himself on a nearby side table, his body oriented toward the doors and windows. Every snap of a twig outside, every rustle of wind through the pine trees, every distant call of a hawk would make those tufted ears pivot and lock onto the source. If Jax detected something unusual, something that did not fit the normal pattern of desert sounds, he would jump down and sit directly at Sterling's feet. His muscles would tense, visible beneath his spotted coat. His entire body coiled like a spring ready to release. He never woke Sterling unless the threat was real, but his presence alone was a comfort. The old man slept better knowing a wild creature deemed him worth protecting. Garrett, Sterling's younger brother, visited every other Saturday. He was a large man with a booming voice and an enthusiasm for life that had not dimmed despite his 67 years. He always knocked loudly, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin before pushing open the door and shouting a greeting. Before Jax's arrival, Garrett would stride right in, pulling Sterling into a bear hug that lifted the older man off his feet. Now, things were different. The first time Garrett visited after Jax moved in, the brother had knocked and entered as usual. He made it exactly 3 steps into the hallway before Jax materialized in front of him. The bobcat stood in the narrowest section of the corridor, his body positioned to block the path completely. He did not hiss or bare his teeth. He simply stood there, solid as a boulder, and stared at the stranger. Garrett froze, his smile faltering. Jax's nostrils flared as he sniffed the newcomer's shoes, his head lowering to inspect the leather and mud. The examination lasted nearly a minute, during which neither Garrett nor Sterling dared to move. Finally, Jax stepped backward 2 paces. He settled into a sitting position and performed a slow blink. his amber eyes closing and opening in that universal feline gesture of trust. Only one then did Sterling motion for Garrett to come in, even after Garrett had been vetted and approved. Jax maintained boundaries. Whenever the younger brother tried to embrace Sterling with one of his characteristic crushing hugs, Jax would appear between them. The bobcat would wedge his body into the gap, using his weight to gently separate the two men. It was not aggressive or jealous. It was protective. Sterling had mentioned, months ago in a conversation with Patricia from the rescue center, that he sometimes found Garrett's physical affection overwhelming. He loved his brother, but Sterling had always needed personal space to feel comfortable. Somehow, through observation and instinct, Jax had learned this. The bobcat had appointed himself the guardian of Sterling's boundaries, ensuring the old man never felt pressured or uncomfortable in his own home. The truth about Jax's behaviors, the real reason behind his obsessive vigilance and territorial control, was revealed during a massive storm in early November. The weather in Sedona could change rapidly, but this storm arrived with unusual violence. Dark clouds rolled over the red rocks like an invading army, turning the afternoon sky nearly black. The first raindrops hit the windows with the force of thrown pebbles, and within seconds the gentle patter had become a roar. Sterling expected Jax to retreat to his usual hiding spot atop the bookshelf. Instead, the bobcat did something unprecedented. He stood on his hind legs, his front paws pressed against the windowsill, his nose almost touching the glass. His entire body was rigid, every muscle tense to the point of trembling. His eyes were huge, pupils dilated despite the lightning that flashed across the sky. He stared out at the curtain of rain with an expression Sterling could only describe as terror. Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it made the dishes in the kitchen cabinets rattle. Jax let out a sound Sterling had never heard before, a keening wail that was part yowl and part scream. The bobcat dropped to all fours and bolted across the living room, diving under the dining table. He pressed himself against the wall, making his body as small as possible, shaking violently. His eyes were wild, unfocused, seeing something that existed only in his memory. Sterling's heart broke at the sight. He moved slowly, not wanting to spook Jax further, and lowered himself to sit on the floor several feet from the table. He spoke softly, meaningless words of comfort, but Jax did not seem to hear him. The bobcat was lost in some terrible place, reliving a trauma Sterling could only guess at. After the storm passed, Sterling sat at his computer desk and opened his email program. He scrolled back through 6 months of messages until he found the one from Patricia. She had mentioned sending a file, something Sterling should watch if he ever wanted to understand Jax better. At the time, Sterling had been so focused on getting the cabin ready for his new housemate that he had forgotten all about it. Now, he clicked the attachment and waited for the video file to load. The footage was grainy, shot from the dashboard camera of a rescue vehicle during another storm. Years earlier, the windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge, creating brief moments of clarity between sweeps. The camera showed a landscape transformed by water. A normally dry wash had become a raging river, the water thick and red with suspended clay, churning with terrifying power. Debris tumbled past, tree branches and rocks and things Sterling could not identify. Then he saw them, 4 small shapes, barely visible through the rain and spray. 4 juvenile bobcats, their spots still pronounced, their bodies tiny and vulnerable. They were trapped on a rapidly shrinking island of rock as the floodwater rose around them. And there was a 5th shape, slightly larger than the others. Jax. Sterling leaned closer to the screen, his weathered hand covering his mouth. The young Jax was using every ounce of strength his small body possessed to push the 3 other kittens up toward higher ground. He bulldozed them with his head, shoved them with his paws, even gripped their scruffs with his teeth to drag them upward. The water was rising fast, fingers of red foam reaching higher with each passing second. Jax kept pushing, kept shoving, his movements frantic but determined. One of the kittens reached a higher ledge, then another. The 3rd kitten scrambled up just as a massive wave surged forward. The wall of water crashed over the rock island with devastating force. When it receded, Jax was gone. For a horrible moment, Sterling thought that was the end of the footage, that this was how Jax had died. But then the camera panned, and Sterling saw a small, spotted shape clinging to a tree branch 15 feet away. Chest heaving, mouth open in a silent cry. The three other kittens were gone. The floodwater had swept them away in an instant, their small bodies no match for the current's power. Jax remained alone on his precarious perch, his claws buried deep in the bark, his entire body shaking. The footage ended with a close-up of Jax's face. His mouth was open in a wail Sterling could not hear over the storm's recorded roar. The young bobcat's eyes were fixed on the churning water, watching helplessly as the flood carried away his siblings, his family, everything he had known. Sterling closed the laptop with shaking hands. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks, disappearing into the white stubble of his beard. Everything made sense now. Every strange behavior, every obsessive habit, every display of control. Jax always laid in the highest places because, in his mind, floodwaters could not reach the summit. He claimed the elevated ground to watch for rising water. He blocked doorways to prevent the flood from entering. When Sterling stood on the wooden floor too long during rainstorms, Jax would jump down and gently grip the old man's pant leg with his teeth, tugging him toward the couch or the armchair. He was trying to save Sterling from being swept away like his siblings had been, the strict order Jax imposed on Zed. The boundaries and rules and constant supervision were not about dominance, they were about safety. Jax had learned the hard way that chaos could kill. He had watched his world torn apart by forces beyond his control. Now, in this cabin, in this new life, he could impose order. He could keep everyone in their proper places. He could make sure no one was lost. Sterling got down on his knees on the hardwood floor, his joints popping in protest. He crawled slowly toward the dining table where Jax still cowered, his body pressed into the corner. Sterling stopped 2 feet away and extended his hand, palm up, fingers loose. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I'm sorry, Jax. I thought you were just being grumpy. Bossy. I didn't understand. I forgot that you carry wounds just like I do." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Jax's head lifted. His amber eyes focused on Sterling's face. The terror in them had receded, replaced by something uncertain but curious. Jax crept forward, inch by careful inch, until his broad forehead pressed against Sterling's palm. The contact was feather-light, tentative, ready to break at any moment. Sterling's other hand moved with glacial slowness toward Jax's head. His fingertips touched the edge of the bobcat's right ear, feeling the ragged scar tissue where a chunk of cartilage had been torn away. A souvenir from the flood, from being thrown against rocks and branches, from fighting to survive. Jax did not pull away. He pressed harder into Sterling's hand, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, he closed his eyes. Two broken souls, separated by species but united by trauma, found each other in that moment beneath a dining table while rain continued to fall outside. From that night forward, the atmosphere in the log cabin changed. It became warmer somehow, despite no change in temperature. The invisible walls that had separated Sterling, Jax, and Zed began to dissolve. When Sterling sat in his armchair, overwhelmed by memories of his late wife and the loneliness that sometimes crushed his chest until he could barely breathe, Jax would appear. The bobcat would jump onto the back of the chair and settle behind Sterling's head. Then, softly at first, but gradually increasing in volume, Jax would begin to purr. The sound was not like a house cat's purr. It was deeper, more powerful, a vibration that Sterling could feel through his entire skull. It thrummed through his bones, seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat, slowing his racing pulse and warming the cold places in his soul. Sterling would lean back, eyes closed, letting the healing frequency wash over him. The vacuum cleaner incident happened on a Tuesday morning. Sterling had been putting off cleaning the cabin, but the dust and dog hair had finally reached critical mass. He dragged the old Hoover out of the closet and plugged it in. The moment the motor roared to life, Zed went berserk. The Husky had always been terrified of the vacuum cleaner, convinced it was some kind of predatory machine that would eat him alive. He barked frantically, lunging at the appliance, then retreating in terror, his blue eyes wild. Before Sterling could even process what was happening, Jax was there. The Bobcat dropped from his perch on the entertainment center and positioned himself between Zed and the roaring vacuum. His body was low, defensive, hackles raised along his spine. This was not dominance behavior. This was protection. In Jax's mind, this loud monster was a threat to his packmate. He pushed against Zed with his shoulder, using his body to herd the panicking Husky into the corner of the room, away from the danger. Then Jax sat firmly between Zed and the vacuum cleaner, his amber eyes fixed on the machine, ready to defend against any attack. Sterling turned off the vacuum. The sudden silence was deafening. He looked at Jax standing guard, at Zed trembling in the corner, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. This broken wild creature, this traumatized survivor, had made protecting others his entire purpose. He could not save his siblings, so he would save whoever was in front of him now. The next storm arrived 3 weeks later. Sterling heard the first rumble of thunder and immediately looked for Jax. The Bobcat was at the window, body tense, but this time he did not run. He stood his ground, though Sterling could see the trembling in his legs. Then, something unexpected happened. Zed, who normally retreated to his bed during storms, walked across the living room and lay down directly next to Jax. The Husky pressed his larger body against the Bobcat's side, offering his warmth and bulk as comfort. Jax turned his head to look at Zed, surprise evident in his wide eyes. Then, very carefully, he lowered himself until he was lying down as well. He rested his head on Zed's thick fur, his tufted ears pressed flat against his skull. The two animals lay there together, watching the rain, united against the fear. Sterling watched from his armchair, too moved to speak. As winter approached, Sterling decided to build something special. He had always been handy with tools, a skill learned during 40 years of working construction. Now, with retirement stretching endlessly before him and two unusual companions depending on him, he wanted to create a space that honored their journey together. He called it the Garden of Trust. The project took 6 weeks. Sterling designed and constructed an elevated wooden walkway that wound through the small garden behind the cabin. The planks were wide enough for him to navigate safely, high enough that Jax would feel secure, and sturdy enough to last decades. The path spiraled outward from the back door, passing through raised garden beds, circling the old cottonwood tree, and ending at a covered platform that overlooked the red rock formations in the distance. The first time Sterling led Jax and Zed out onto the walkway, he was not sure what to expect. Jax immediately jumped onto the railing, balancing with ease, and began to walk. But he did not race ahead as Sterling anticipated. Instead, the Bobcat stopped every 20 feet or so and turned his head to look back. He waited, amber eyes patient, until Sterling caught up on his old legs. Only then would Jax continue forward. He had learned that leadership was not about racing ahead. It was about ensuring everyone could follow. Every late afternoon, weather permitting, the three of them would make their way onto the walkway for what Sterling called the sunset ritual. They would settle on the final platform, the one with the best view of the western sky. Jax would sit between Sterling and Zed, one massive paw resting on the Husky's shoulder in a gesture that had evolved from dominance to affection. Zed would lay his head on Sterling's leg, a contented sigh escaping his mouth. The three of them would sit in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson and violet. Their three shadows would merge on the wooden planks, stretching longer and longer as the sun descended. One elderly man, one rescued in Bobcat, one goofy Husky, a family formed not by blood or even by choice, but by the simple fact that they had all been broken and had decided to heal together. Mornings developed their own ritual. Jax was always the first to wake, his internal clock calibrated to the precise moment before dawn. But he no longer prowled the cabin in tense vigilance. Instead, he would simply lie near Sterling's bedroom door, watching the slowly brightening sky through the window. He waited, patient and still, for the first ray of sunlight to creep across the floor and touch Sterling's face. When Sterling's eyes opened, the very first thing he saw was Jax's face mere inches away, those amber eyes, once filled with such suspicion and fear, now held only warmth. Jax would perform a slow blink, closing his eyes for a full second before opening them again. It was a promise. Sterling had learned. A promise that said, "You are safe, I am here. Nothing will harm you while I watch." On a particularly beautiful morning in December, with the air crisp and clean after a night rain, Sterling stood on the back porch with his coffee. Jax was on the railing, as was his custom, surveying his territory. Suddenly, the bobcat's ears perked forward. His entire body went rigid, focused on something in the deep forest that bordered the cabin's property. Sterling heard it then, a sound he had not heard in the 6 months Jax had lived with them. The distant yowl of a wild bobcat, echoing through the pine trees. A call from Jax's own kind, from the wilderness where he had been born. Jax's head turned toward the sound, his nostrils flaring. The call came again, closer this time, and Sterling's heart clenched. He thought about Jax's wild nature, about the pull of instinct, about the fact that Sterling had no legal claim to keep this creature here. If Jax wanted to leave, wanted to return to the forest and the life he had been born to, Sterling would not stop him. The bobcat stared into the dark green depths of the forest for a long moment. Sterling could see the conflict in his tense shoulders, in the way his tail twitched. Then Jax turned his head and looked back at the cabin. Through the window, Zed was visible, sprawled on his dog bed, tongue lolling in a ridiculous grin. The kitchen light was on, warm and inviting. The scent of coffee and bacon drifted out through the open door. Jax jumped down from the railing. He walked past Sterling without hesitation, his tail flicking upward in what Sterling had learned was a sign of contentment. The bobcat padded through the door and into the warm interior of the cabin. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Sterling. Then, very deliberately, Jax reached out one hind leg and pulled the door halfway closed behind him, as if shutting out the wild and choosing the warmth within. Sterling stood on the porch for a long time, his coffee growing cold in his hands, tears streaming freely down his weathered face. Jax had made his choice, not because he was trapped or because he had no other option, but because he understood something fundamental about strength and leadership. The truly strong do not walk ahead to leave someone behind. They walk to ensure no one is left alone. Inside the cabin, Jax settled onto the window seat, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws. Zed wandered over and, without asking permission, flopped down on the cushion beside him. For a moment, Jax considered enforcing the boundary, reclaiming his territory. Then he simply adjusted his position to make room, allowing the Husky to share the space. Through the window, the red rocks of Sedona glowed in the morning light, eternal and unchanging. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. Jax was no longer a lone wild beast, broken by trauma and defined by survival. He was a commander who led through companionship rather than fear. He was a protector who knew the difference between dominance and devotion. He was a member of a family, strange and unconventional as it was, that had chosen each other through the simple act of refusing to give up. Sterling came inside and settled into his armchair, the leather creaking under his weight. Jax's ears swiveled toward him, tracking his movement. But the bobcat did not leave his spot by the window. He did not need to patrol anymore. He did not need to guard every entrance or claim every high ground. He was safe. They were all safe. The old man smiled, the deep wrinkles around his eyes crinkling with genuine joy for the first time in years. He had learned something important during these months with Jax and Zed. Healing did not always arrive in gentle forms, wrapped in soft blankets and warm words. Sometimes healing came with teeth and claws, with hard lessons about boundaries and respect. Sometimes it came in the shape of a powerful bobcat who had to rebuild his entire world before he could give away his trust. And sometimes, Sterling thought as he watched Jax's chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep, the greatest gift we can give each other is not protection from pain. It is the creation of a space where broken hearts can find each other, where they can rest without fear, where they can finally heal together. Outside, another call echoed from the forest. Jax's ears twitched, but he did not open his eyes. He knew where he belonged, The sunset ritual would come in a few hours, and until then, there was nothing more important than this moment. Three souls, once shattered, now whole. A log cabin in Sedona that had become more than shelter. It had become home. It had become safety. It had become the place where even the wildest hearts could find peace. The greatest power of a leader, Sterling understood now, was not the right to rule. It was the ability to create a safe space where broken hearts could find each other and heal together. And in this small cabin among the red rocks, three unlikely souls had done exactly that. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.